Good evening from the Forbidden Dispensary. Tonight we're opening a drawer that never really stays shut. Something colder than folklore, older than medicine, and still waiting in the dark corners of the modern world with its mouth half open. Rabies. Not the movie version, not the tidy moral lesson where a hero is saved at the last second and the monster is cleanly destroyed. Rabies is not a creature you can bargain with. It doesn't roar. It waits. It travels quietly, up a nerve, inch by inch, until the body's ordinary rules are no longer obeyed. And for most of human history, if you were bitten and the wrong kind of time began inside you, the outcome was almost ceremonial in its certainty. Before we step into it, take a breath. If you're listening late, keep the room dim. If you're listening early, you may want to pretend it's later. Either way, we're going down the same corridor, the long human attempt to explain a disease that looks like possession, behaves like a curse, and ends like a verdict. In the oldest cities, where walls were built from clay and fear was built from repetition, people lived too close to animals to ever forget what teeth can do. In the river valley heat, in streets that smelled of bread and silt and refuse, dogs moved the way rumors move, everywhere, half-owned, half-wild, tolerated until they weren't. They slept near thresholds, they followed butchers, they guarded courtyards, they belonged to households and to no one at all. The first people to record the terror were not physicians, they were administrators. A scribe doesn't write virus, a scribe writes liability, a scribe writes payment, a scribe writes the moment a private tragedy becomes a public problem. In early legal codes and civic records across the ancient world, you find the same practical dread translated into blunt governance. If an animal bites, who is responsible? If a dog becomes dangerous, what must be done? How does a city protect itself when the threat can't be seen, only witnessed in what comes after? That's the earliest architecture of rabies control. Not science, not even medicine law. The community trying to discipline chance. But law was never enough because the illness didn't behave like a simple wound infection. People could survive terrible bites and die from small ones. The wound could heal beautifully and still become a doorway. Time could pass, days, weeks, sometimes longer, and then the victim would change. Not in a slow way that looks like ordinary sickness, but in a sudden wrongness that makes neighbors step back. A man who can't swallow, a child who screams at the sight of water, an animal that becomes a weapon against its own life. No wonder the earliest explanations arrived wearing religious clothes. In many cultures, dogs were not merely animals. They were boundary creatures. They lived at the edge between household and street, between cleanliness and waste, between human intention and animal appetite. They guarded gates. They circled graves. They were companions, scavengers, and symbols. In some places, they were tied to healing because they licked wounds, because they seemed to know pain, because people needed an emblem that could stand between injury and death. So when a dog's bite led to madness, the spiritual imagination didn't have to stretch very far. The bite became a message. The foam became a sign. The terror of water became a ritual inversion. The thing that gives life now triggers convulsion. Rabies didn't just kill, it performed. And performance invites story. If you listen to old languages long enough, you hear the disease hiding inside words for rage, frenzy, unclean spirit, wolf hunger. Many traditions didn't distinguish neatly between infection and possession, because in the lived experience, what was the difference? The victim looked seized. The animal looked transformed. The household looked cursed. The mind, normally private, normally stable, became public spectacle. It's easy to mock ancient beliefs if you've never watched someone choke on their own thirst. In the classical world, observers began to do something that would eventually become medicine. They started writing down what they saw. Not just prayers, not just prohibitions, descriptions, the fixed points of a pattern, a bite, a period of apparent recovery, a turn toward agitation or paralysis, a fear of water that isn't mere fear, but a reflexive war inside the throat, excess saliva because swallowing has become betrayal, spasms, delirium, and an ending that arrives fast once the mind is involved. They didn't know about neurons. They didn't know about viral particles shaped like bullets. They didn't know about retrograde transport and synaptic hijacking. But they knew one thing with brutal clarity. The bite mattered, and what followed was not ordinary. So the ancient world did what humans always do when faced with something that kills predictably but cannot be predicted in the individual case. It built a patchwork of remedies. Some of them were practical in a way that makes modern readers nod despite themselves. Wash the wound, keep it open, let it bleed, scrape it, cauterize it, remove tissue that might carry whatever invisible evil has entered. The tools were crude iron, fire, knife, but the intuition was recognizable. If the disaster begins at the wound, then perhaps the wound is where you can still bargain. Other remedies were symbolic, and symbolic remedies are not always foolish. They are social technologies. They create the feeling of action. They recruit the community. They give the victim and the family a script to follow when the alternative is waiting. A charm tied at the wrist, an invocation spoken over water, a ritual cleansing, a vow made at a shrine. If you've ever sat in a hospital corridor while a loved one is taken behind a door you can't open, you understand exactly why those rituals existed. They weren't just superstition. They were a way to keep the mind from dissolving. But Rabies has never respected the psychological needs of its witnesses. As centuries turned, the disease braided itself into folklore, not because people were naive, but because the symptoms are so violently theatrical, they beg for metaphor. A familiar creature becomes unpredictable and aggressive. A person becomes unrecognizable. Teeth become the instrument of transmission. Blood becomes suspect. Nighttime becomes a stage. The village becomes a rumor mill with a heartbeat. This is where the old monster gallery begins to look less like fantasy and more like cultural memory. The werewolf is an obvious one. A man who behaves like an animal. A neighbor whose eyes don't track correctly. Violence that seems to arrive from nowhere. The community's desperate need to identify a cause and isolate it. In small societies where social trust is survival, an inexplicable violent illness is not merely medical, it is political. Someone must be blamed. Someone must be named. And if the disease can be carried by a bite, then the line between sick and dangerous becomes thin enough to cut skin. The vampire comes in through a different door, but it leads to the same room. Fear of contagion, fear of transformation, fear that something that looks human is no longer safe. The vampire story is not rabies in a laboratory sense, but in an emotional sense it rhymes. Biting, blood, nocturnal panic, and communities taking extreme measures to restore control. Digging, staking, burning, because action feels better than uncertainty. What's striking is how often these legends sit beside real civic practice. Ordinances about stray animals, village rules about killing dogs that behave strangely, laws assigning fines for bites, local authorities authorizing destruction as prevention. The same society that tells stories about wolves in human skin also writes down in formal language what to do when a dog becomes a hazard. Myth and governance grow up together, not as opposites, but as parallel responses to the same terror. And this is the part people forget when they try to tell a simple story about human progress. We did not move neatly from darkness to light. We moved from darkness to different kinds of darkness. From fear of demons to fear of unseen contagion. From prayers to procedures. From scapegoats to statistics. We learned to name the mechanisms, and then we had to confront the new question. What do you do with a mechanism that still kills almost everyone once it declares itself? As empires rose and folded into new orders, rabies persisted as a civic menace. Not constant everywhere, but always close enough that people remembered. In towns where animals lived among humans, a rabid dog was not only a medical emergency, it was social instability on 4 legs. It threatened children, trade, order, and the legitimacy of whoever claimed to govern. So you start seeing the machinery of control, impoundment, muzzling, culling, and the slow birth of public health as an idea. Not noble, not gentle, often brutal, but recognizable. A government learning that the body is part of governance. The leash is an instrument of affection, yes. It's also an instrument of the state. When cities grew denser, those instruments multiplied. Dog catchers became municipal employees. Pounds became infrastructure. Regulations became routine. A bite wasn't only a matter for the victim's family, it was paperwork. It was a report. It was a decision about quarantine, observation, destruction. The city began to treat an animal's behavior as a public signal, something to be managed for the common good. And still, medicine did not have a cure. Not in the way we mean it. Not once the symptoms came. That's what made rabies so psychologically powerful. It was a disease that mocked the idea of intervention. You could wash the wound and hope. You could cauterize and pray. You could amputate and bargain with fate. But if the illness had already started its quiet climb, the rest was usually a countdown. Which brings us, inevitably, to the moment the story always turns. Not because humans became wiser overnight, but because method became stubborn. In the 19th century, the laboratory began to compete with the shrine. Not as an absolute replacement, people rarely give up old strategies entirely, but as a new authority. Researchers began to demonstrate something that changed everything. Rabies could be transmitted reliably in controlled conditions. It wasn't a random curse, it wasn't a moral stain. It was an agent, small, invisible, consistent enough to study. That realization didn't comfort people at first. In some ways, it made the terror sharper. If it's an agent, then it can travel. If it can travel, then it can spread. If it can spread, then every bite is a potential fuse. But it also meant something else, something quietly revolutionary. If the disease has rules, then the rules can be interrupted. In that atmosphere of grim, they're about ethics, about fear turned into institutional power, about who gets saved first and who waits. They're about a child brought to a laboratory, a series of injections, and a world suddenly forced to imagine that one of its oldest terrors might be negotiated. Not by prayer, not by fire, but by technique. Stay with the Forbidden Dispensary. In Part 2, we step into the age of experiments, the drama of early vaccination, the uncomfortable marriage between civic authority and laboratory authority, and the way a single, successful rescue can become a blueprint, whether or not the blueprint is ready. By the time the 19th century reached its middle decades, Europe and America were filled with a particular kind of confidence. Not the old confidence of priests, but the newer confidence of men with notebooks, glassware, and the nerve to believe that nature could be interrogated. Cities were swelling. Trade routes were tightening the world into a smaller, louder machine. Dogs still moved through streets and courtyards, but now they moved through a civilization increasingly obsessed with classification, species, symptoms, causes, laws. Rabies did not disappear in that world, it simply became harder to explain away. The old explanations, curse, moral corruption, witchcraft, still surfaced whenever a community panicked. But in the clinics, in the veterinary schools, in the new laboratories that smelled of disinfectant and damp paper, another language began to take over. Transmission, incubation, inoculation. The disease shifted, slowly, from mythic horror to experimental object. It's worth pausing on what that meant in human terms. To make rabies experimental required doing something repellent and intimate. It required taking material from the sick, saliva, nervous tissue, and placing it into the healthy. It required sacrificing animals not as punishment or spectacle, but as method. It required building a bridge from a street-level terror to a benchtop procedure. And it required, above all, patience. Because rabies is not generous with time. It offers a long silence, then a short catastrophe. Experiments had to wait. Researchers had to keep animals alive long enough to see what would happen, and then to repeat the process until the pattern could no longer be denied. The pattern, once established, was electric. A bite could transmit the disease. So could inoculation with infectious material. The agent favored nervous tissue. The path from wound to madness was not mystical. It was anatomical in a way that suggested a kind of inevitability. The illness did not spread like a rash across the skin, nor like a fever through the blood. It traveled by a private route, a slow climb toward the brain. And because it traveled slowly, there was a window, small, cruel, and precious, in which intervention might still matter. This is the window that would change human history with rabies. But like everything else in medicine, it arrived not as a clean solution, but as a set of messy gambles. In that era, the word virus still carried its older meaning. Poison. Something bad in the body, something that corrupted, something that could be drawn out or burned away. The modern concept of a virus, submicroscopic, filterable, replicating, had not yet fully crystallized. The microscope had limits. Filters were becoming tools. Biology was in the awkward adolescence between superstition and certainty. Yet even without full clarity on what the agent was, researchers could see what it did. And if you can see what a thing does, you can sometimes learn how to disrupt it. The disruption that mattered most came from an idea both simple and dangerous. Attenuation. Weaken the agent, train the body, prevent the fatal cascade. It sounds clean when summarized. It was not clean in practice. It was animal rooms and stained aprons. It was spinal cords laid out to dry. It was schedules measured in days, like a morbid calendar. It was the deliberate construction of a gradient preparations made less lethal, then slightly more, then more again, administered in sequence as if the immune system could be taught by ascending steps. And in a sense, that's exactly what happened. The most famous name attached to this turning point is Louis Pasteur, though the story is never one man alone. It's collaborators, technicians, physicians who lend legitimacy, institutions that turn one event into a system. Pasteur's genius in this context was not just conceptual, it was theatrical. He understood that science doesn't live only in journals, it lives in public trust, and public trust requires dramatic proof. The drama arrived in the form of a child, a boy mauled, multiple bites, severe exposure, the kind of incident that made families go white and municipal officials reach for their ledgers. In earlier centuries, this would have been a sentence postponed by a few weeks of normal life. The wound would heal, the family would start to breathe again. Then the first strange complaints, tingling, restlessness, a sour fever. Then the turn, agitation, terror, the body refusing water, the mind becoming a storm. Then death. That was the old script. The new script asked whether science could break it. A child brought to a laboratory is not a symbol. It is a moral emergency. Even now, in modern hospitals, clinicians talk about the cold weight that settles when a pediatric case is likely fatal. In the 1880s, without modern ethics boards, without standardized consent frameworks, without the infrastructure we pretend makes us more civilized, the decision was raw. Do nothing and watch the child die, or attempt an experimental prevention that could itself cause harm. It's easy from a distance to romanticize the moment. It's also easy to condemn it. The honest truth is harder. The choice was made under pressure, and once the child survived, the world reinterpreted the choice as destiny. The boy lived. The story spread faster than any controlled trial ever could. This is how medicine often changes, not by the quiet accumulation of evidence alone, but by a single event that society decides to treat as proof. A public miracle, a headline rescue, something simple enough to repeat in conversation and terrifying enough to make people pay attention. Suddenly, rabies was no longer merely a horror. It was an emergency with a potential response. Not a cure after symptoms, but a prevention after exposure. An intervention that had to be administered quickly, carefully, in a controlled sequence. The implication was profound. It meant the bite was no longer a moment of pure fate. It was a moment that demanded action, and that action demanded infrastructure. Infrastructure is where the story always becomes political. To provide post-exposure treatment, you need an institution that can prepare the material, maintain standards, and administer it. You need trained personnel. You need money. You need a public that believes in the method enough to submit to it and to fund it. You need governments willing to treat prevention as a civic obligation rather than a private misfortune. This is how the Pasteur Institute model spread, as a hybrid creature laboratory, clinic, and public trust engine. It wasn't just about rabies. It was about the modern idea that science could be institutionalized, that salvation could be manufactured. And once that belief took hold, it altered everything around it. Cities that had relied on dog catchers, muzzles, and mass killing campaigns now had another lever. Municipalities could fund vaccination of bite victims. Governments could boast of modernity. We have a response. Colonial administrations could adopt the method not only to protect lives, but to protect commerce and legitimacy. A colony that looked hygienic was a colony that looked governable. A port that looked safe was a port that kept ships coming. The vaccine did not replace law. It sat beside law, and sometimes it hardened law. Because once prevention exists, failure becomes negligence. A bite victim who dies without receiving treatment becomes a scandal. An owner whose dog bites becomes a legal target. A municipality that fails to control stray dogs becomes culpable. The existence of a technical remedy changes the moral landscape. It creates new duties and new accusations. It also created a new kind of inequality. If post-exposure vaccination is available in a capital city, but not in rural districts, then survival becomes geographic. If it is expensive, then survival becomes economic. If it is administered by a prestigious institute, then those who can reach the institute get to keep their children, and those who cannot are left with prayers and burial. That's one of the recurring cruelties of medical progress. The first people to benefit are not always the most at risk. They are often the most connected. And still, even imperfect distribution altered the historical ledger. The idea that a bite could be answered with something other than iron or prayer was not a small philosophical shift. It was an emotional shift. It changed what parents believed, what doctors promised, what cities felt obligated to do. But the early vaccines were not the sleek products we imagine today. They were labor-intensive and biologically messy. They relied on nerve tissue and complex preparation. They required animals. They required careful timing. They could produce complications. They demanded a degree of organizational discipline that many regions did not have, which meant the world entered an era of parallel strategies. On one side, civic control muzzles, pounds, culling, quarantine, import restrictions, municipal ordinances. On the other, medical intervention, post-exposure vaccination, and gradually a professionalized system of response. Neither side alone could solve the problem. Together they could reduce it. But reduction is not elimination, and rabies is unforgiving with gaps. A single missed exposure, a single unvaccinated dog population, a single breakdown in cold chain or supply, and the ancient pattern could reassert itself. And this is where the story moves from the heroic to the administrative. Because after the first dramatic successes, the work became boring. The work became schedules, inventories, training, reporting. The work became a question of whether a clinic had the vaccine that week, whether a physician knew the proper regimen, whether a family could afford transportation to return for multiple doses, whether the wound was cleaned properly, because even then, before modern immunology was fully articulated, clinicians recognized something brutally practical. What you do in the first minutes after the bite can matter as much as what you do in the following weeks. Wash the wound, flush it, scrub it, reduce the amount of infectious material before it finds its path. That instruction, simple, physical, unromantic, belongs to the oldest and newest chapters of the story at once. It is one of those rare moments where ancient intuition and modern evidence hold hands without irony. But if the late 19th century gave the world a prevention strategy, the next century would give it something else. A clearer picture of what rabies looks like under a microscope, and a more reliable way to confirm what people had long feared. A disease that once belonged to rumor and symptom would become a disease that could be stamped with laboratory certainty. And certainty changes how societies behave. Because when you can confirm rabies in an animal, you can decide whether exposed humans need treatment. When you can confirm it quickly, you can do it in time. When you can trace variants, you can map reservoirs and routes of spread. You can turn superstition into surveillance. You can turn panic into policy. But to do that, you first need to see the disease in tissue, not as a ghost, but as a signature. That signature would arrive in a way that feels almost poetic in its grimness. A mark inside neurons, a microscopic relic that made rabies visible in death long before it could be reliably detected in life. In Part 3, we move into pathology and proof, the hunt for diagnostic signatures, the rise of fluorescent testing, the slow birth of virology, and the way laboratories began to outpace folklore, not by making the story less frightening, but by making it precise. There's a particular kind of comfort in confirmation. Not comfort like relief, rabies rarely gives that, but comfort like a hard surface under your hand in a dark room. For centuries, communities lived with rabies as a thing inferred. An animal acts wrong, a person dies badly, and the story completes itself. But inference is slippery. It leaves space for denial, for scapegoats, for myth to do what myth always does: fill gaps with teeth. The laboratory age began to close those gaps. Not quickly, not cleanly, and not without its own violence. But it did something older societies could not do with consistency. It made rabies legible as a distinct biological event. A disease that could be identified, named with more than fear, pinned to tissue and pattern rather than rumor. In the early 20th century, pathology gave rabies one of its most famous signatures: a small, eerie stamp inside the nerve cells of the dead. Not a confession from a demon, not a curse you could smell. A physical mark, visible under a microscope, sitting inside the very cells that make a mind possible. Those inclusions, later called negri bodies, became for decades a kind of grim shorthand. Find them in certain regions of the brain and you had your answer. It wasn't perfect, it never is, but it was a leap from the era when diagnosis was mostly an argument and post-mortem certainty was a luxury. To imagine what this meant in practice, picture the chain of events that follows a bite in a world with limited resources. A dog bites a child. The family panics. The neighbors shout. Someone kills the dog. Now the question is immediate and cruel. Do you put the child through an expensive, painful, time-consuming post-exposure regimen, or do you gamble that the dog was simply aggressive, not rabid? Without a reliable diagnostic tool, the gamble was forced. And in communities where medicine costs money and time costs wages, gambles get made. Pathology offered a way out of pure guessing. If the animal could be examined, if its brain could be tested, then public health decisions could be based on evidence rather than dread. The cost is obvious and unpleasant. It required killing and dissecting animals. But for authorities tasked with protecting populations, the calculus was blunt. One confirmed rabid animal could justify the treatment of many exposed humans. One confirmed negative test could spare a family weeks of injections they might not be able to complete. This is how modern public health begins to reshape old terrors, not by eliminating the horror, but by giving it a workflow. Yet even as microscopy improved, the identity of the agent remained strangely elusive. Rabies did not behave like the bacterial villains being unmasked in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. It would not grow on standard culture media. It passed through filters that trapped bacteria. It was infectious, but invisible to the tools that had made bacteriology feel triumphant. That's where the concept of a virus, in the modern sense, hardened. Rabies became part of the category of filterable agents, infections caused by something smaller than bacteria, something that required new methods and new humility. And once rabies was understood as viral, it entered a different universe of scientific handling. Viral diseases are not just organisms you can corral in a petri dish. They are parasites of the cell's internal machinery, and they force science to become more precise, more invasive, and more dependent on infrastructure. You need cell culture, you need animal models, you need biosafety discipline, you need technicians who don't flinch easily. The 20th century delivered those things, unevenly and with political fingerprints all over them. As laboratories became more capable, rabies diagnosis became faster and more standardized. A major step came with immunologic techniques, methods that could detect viral antigens with tagged antibodies, turning infection into a kind of glowing signal under the right equipment. The most important of these, for much of the modern era, was the direct fluorescent antibody test. In practical terms, it meant this: take a sample of brain tissue from the suspect animal, prepare a slide, add fluorescently labeled antibodies that bind to rabies antigen, and look under a fluorescence microscope. If the antigen is there, it lights up in a characteristic pattern. The result can be obtained quickly, hours, not days. Fast enough to guide decisions while they still matter. This test did something profound. It made rabies diagnosis not just possible, but routinized. It turned a once mythic affliction into something that could be processed through a lab. And again, routinization is power. It's the difference between panic and protocol. But protocols are only as strong as the systems that deliver them. A well-funded lab in a major city can perform fluorescent testing promptly. A rural clinic, where most bites occur in many countries, may have no access to such testing at all. Samples may have to travel long distances without proper cold chain. Bureaucracy can slow courier systems. Political instability can turn a supply route into a dead end. So even as diagnostic technology advanced, the unevenness of infrastructure ensured that rabies remained, in many places, a disease of inequality. And in that inequality, the ancient dread survives. Not as myth, but as economics. By the late 20th century, a new diagnostic language arrived: molecular detection. The ability to identify rabies viral RNA through amplification techniques, methods that could, in principle, detect infection with extraordinary sensitivity. PCR and its adaptations for RNA viruses changed the map of infectious disease diagnostics. Instead of needing large amounts of antigen, you could detect genetic traces. In the rabies context, molecular tests became tools for difficult cases and for surveillance. They were especially valuable because rabies virus shedding can be intermittent and living diagnosis can be complicated. In living patients, samples might include saliva, skin biopsies from hair-bearing regions, cerebrospinal fluid, sometimes corneal impressions in older protocols. No single sample is perfect. Negative results can mislead. Timing matters. Technique matters. The virus does not cooperate. Yet molecular methods offered something else beyond yes-no diagnosis. They offered lineage. Sequencing turned rabies into a detective story of origins. A confirmed case could be linked to a regional variant. An outbreak could be traced. Reservoirs could be distinguished. Was this dog-mediated rabies? Bat-associated? Spillover from wildlife? Imported from another region? This mattered because modern rabies control is not just about treating individual bite victims. It's about breaking transmission chains at scale. If a region is dealing with a canine lineage, the strategy is mass dog vaccination and responsible ownership enforcement. If the problem is wildlife, raccoons, foxes, skunks, bats, then the tools change. Oral vaccines in baits, ecological mapping, public education that targets different behaviors and exposures. In other words, diagnosis and surveillance shape policy, and policy shapes whose children live. But even with better diagnostics, one core reality stayed constant. Symptomatic rabies remained almost universally fatal. The laboratory could tell you what happened. It could confirm what people already feared. But it could not, in most cases, bring the patient back once the brain was involved. That's what made prevention the true battleground. The 20th century, then, became an era of refining what Pasteur's time had begun. Early post-exposure vaccines were effective but risky. Many were made from nerve tissue and could cause serious adverse reactions, neuroparalytic complications, inconsistent potency, and a burden of side effects that was tolerated only because the alternative was death. Over decades, vaccines improved. Production moved away from nerve tissue towards safer substrates. Cell culture methods produced vaccines that were purer, more consistent, and less likely to cause severe complications. Regimens were standardized, debated, revised. Public health agencies built guidelines that tried to balance efficacy, safety, and cost. And cost, always cost, remained the hinge, because the best vaccine is useless if it isn't in the clinic. Post-exposure prophylaxis is, in principle, one of the most elegant interventions in infectious disease. Clean the wound aggressively to reduce the infectious dose. Administer vaccine on schedule to stimulate active immunity. For the most severe exposures, deep wounds, bites to the head and neck, multiple bites, add passive immunization through rabies immunoglobulin infiltrated around the wound to neutralize virus immediately at the site. It's straightforward, it's effective, it's almost boring in its logic, but it is also a logistical ritual. It requires supplies, training, cold chain, follow-up, and public awareness. It requires that the bite victim come in time and that the clinic can respond in time. It requires a system that doesn't break. Where systems break, rabies thrives. This is why, in many parts of the world, rabies is best understood not as a failure of modern science, but as a failure of distribution. The same century that built fluorescent microscopy and molecular sequencing also built massive disparities in access. In some countries, a bite is treated with immediate PEP and laboratory confirmation of the animal within hours. In others, the bite is treated with folk remedies and the animal is disposed of without testing, and the family waits, hoping the silence after the wound heals is not the beginning of a countdown. And because rabies can incubate for weeks, sometimes months, hope can become habit. People return to work, children return to play. The story fades, until it doesn't. In Part 4, we move into prevention as a global system. The economics of vaccines and immunoglobulin, the rise of intradermal dose-sparing regimens, the harsh arithmetic of who gets treated, and why mass dog vaccination is the most unromantic miracle public health has ever produced. Prevention is never as cinematic as catastrophe. No one builds statues to a cold chain that didn't fail. No one writes ballads about a nurse who diluted nothing, mislabeled nothing, and kept a schedule perfectly for 30 days. And yet rabies is a disease whose modern story is almost entirely a story of prevention, or the absence of it. Because once symptoms begin, medicine is mostly watching. Once symptoms begin, even the finest ICU becomes a room where time is counted in hours and the outcome is negotiated more by biology than by intention. So the real battleground is earlier, quieter, and more ordinary. The clinic visit after the bite, the running water at a sink, the soap, the disinfectant, the decision to seek care instead of waiting, the decision by a government to stock vaccine not only in capitals but in districts, the decision to treat rabies as a civic responsibility rather than an individual misfortune. Post-exposure prophylaxis sounds like a technical phrase, but in practice it is a ritual with very specific steps. And every step is a point where the world can fail. The first step is humiliatingly simple: wash the wound. Not a symbolic rinse, not a quick splash. Aggressive washing, soap, water, flushing, mechanical scrubbing, because what you are doing in those first minutes is not cleaning in the polite sense. You are reducing the viral inoculum. You are trying to remove as much infectious material as possible before it binds and begins its quiet ascent. This is one of the harshest ironies in modern global health. The most important initial intervention requires almost no technology, just clean water, soap, and knowledge. Yet in some regions, even that is not guaranteed at the moment it is needed. After wound care comes the fork in the road: vaccination and sometimes passive immunization. Modern rabies vaccines, cell culture-based, purified, consistent, are extremely effective when administered properly and on time. But properly and on time are systems words. They depend on logistics, training, and access. Schedules have been refined over decades. Different regimens exist, but they share a principle: multiple doses spaced across weeks to stimulate a rapid and durable immune response. In wealthy settings, the default route has often been intramuscular administration. Reliable, easy to teach, easy to standardize. But the world where rabies kills most often is not the wealthy world. It is the world where vaccine supply is tight, where families cannot afford repeated clinic visits, where health systems stretch a vial the way a household stretches rice. That's where a quieter revolution matters: intradermal vaccination. The skin is not just a wrapper, it is an immune organ. It is rich with antigen-presenting cells that notice threats and call for reinforcements. Delivering vaccine into the dermis can produce strong immunity using less antigen than intramuscular injection. Less antigen means less vaccine per person. Less vaccine per person means more people treated per vial. It is dose-sparing in the most literal sense, a strategy designed for scarcity built out of immunologic reality. This is the kind of innovation that rarely gets romantic credit because it doesn't feel like discovery. It feels like administration. But it changes death tolls. When intradermal regimens are implemented correctly, when staff are trained, when patients can return for follow-up, when supply management is tight, program costs drop. And when costs drop, barriers fall. And when barriers fall, people arrive earlier. Earlier is everything, because the virus is slow only in one direction. It is slow traveling from the wound to the brain. Once it reaches the brain and symptoms begin, it is ferociously fast. Then there is the darker component of post-exposure prophylaxis, rabies immunoglobulin. Passive immunization exists because vaccines take time to work. The body needs days to begin producing its own neutralizing antibodies at high levels. For high-risk exposures, deep bites, multiple bites, bites to the face and neck, exposures with heavy contamination, those days can matter. The immunoglobulin provides immediate antibodies that can neutralize virus at the wound site. But rabies immunoglobulin is both precious and scarce. It also demands technique. It is not enough to inject it into a muscle and hope. The critical step is infiltration into and around the wound, flooding the exposure site with antibodies where the virus is trying to establish itself. In many places, the immunoglobulin is unavailable. In others, it is used incorrectly because the training is insufficient or the supply is too limited, and staff ration it in ways that reduce effectiveness. Again, rabies is a disease that punishes small failures. This is why rabies remains, in the global era, a disease of inequity more than a disease of ignorance. The science is not mysterious. The prevention is not experimental. The barriers are familiar. Supply chains, cost, geography, governance. When researchers estimate global rabies deaths in the tens of thousands per year, often cited around 60,000 annually, concentrated in Asia and Africa, those numbers are not simply biology. They are the shape of missing infrastructure. A clinic with no vaccine is not a clinic. It is a waiting room for tragedy. A family that cannot afford transport is not non-compliant. It is trapped in arithmetic. A health worker without intradermal training is not negligent. They are unprepared by the system that hired them. And now we arrive at the central truth that public health keeps repeating because it is so ugly and so solvable. The cheapest way to prevent human rabies deaths is to vaccinate dogs. Not a few dogs. Not the dogs of the wealthy. Not only the pets that sleep indoors. The roaming dogs. The community dogs, the dogs that belong to everyone and therefore to no one. The dogs that produce the majority of human exposures in endemic regions. If you stop transmission in dogs, you stop the majority of human rabies. That is not a slogan, it is epidemiology. Field programs have converged on a practical target. Vaccinate roughly 70% of the dog population consistently enough to interrupt transmission. The exact number shifts with local conditions, dog turnover, movement patterns, density, but the core concept holds. When enough dogs are immune, the virus cannot reliably find new hosts. The chain breaks. Human exposures fall. The demand for human PEP falls. And as the demand falls, budgets can be redirected towards sustaining dog vaccination rather than constantly paying for emergency human treatment. It's an elegant feedback loop. But to start it, you need money and organization. You need a government willing to spend now to save later. You need public cooperation. You need teams that can catch and vaccinate dogs, record coverage, return the next year, and the year after that. This is where rabies elimination is made or lost. Not in a breakthrough, but in repetition. Programs that have succeeded, parts of Latin America most famously, did not succeed because their virus was kinder. They succeeded because they treated rabies as a regional project, not a series of isolated emergencies. Surveillance improved. Dog vaccination became routine. Public education reduced risky exposures and increased prompt clinic visits. The result was dramatic. Human rabies deaths from dogs fell to near zero in many areas where they had once been ordinary. Europe confronted wildlife rabies with a different tool: oral vaccination campaigns. Baits distributed across landscapes, sometimes by aircraft, targeted foxes and other wildlife reservoirs. The idea sounds almost absurd until you remember what rabies demands. Break transmission at the reservoir, or you will be treating spillover forever. Oral wildlife vaccination works when it is comprehensive and sustained. It is expensive. It is logistically complex. It requires careful mapping, border coordination, monitoring uptake, and maintaining distribution zones over time. But in regions where it has been done well, it has driven rabies back with a force that feels almost like rewriting ecology. And this brings us to a point that always makes people uncomfortable. Mass killing of dogs, culling, has often been used as a reflexive rabies control measure, and it is frequently ineffective. It can reduce visible dog numbers temporarily. It can satisfy political pressure. It can create the impression of action. But it can also backfire epidemiologically. Remove dogs from a neighborhood and you create empty territory. Empty territory is quickly refilled by migration from nearby areas and by increased birth rates among the remaining dogs. The population rebounds. The social network reshapes. Transmission can persist or re-establish. Meanwhile, culling can undermine community trust, making owners hide dogs and avoid cooperation with vaccinators. This is the public health version of a familiar mistake, choosing the visible action over the effective one. Dog vaccination is slower, quieter, and more humane. It also works, but it's not automatic. It requires a workforce, budget lines, supply management, and community engagement. It requires governance that doesn't flinch after the first year and call the project complete when the data says otherwise. Rabies punishes that kind of political impatience. In recent decades, global health agencies have tried to impose a narrative of ambition: end dog-mediated human rabies deaths by 2030. It's a target that functions as both moral claim and planning tool. It says, this is preventable, therefore tolerating it is unjust. It also says, elimination is feasible with known tools, therefore failure is not scientific, it is administrative. Yet administrative failure is the easiest kind to excuse. Budgets are tight, priorities shift, ministers change, outbreaks of other diseases steal attention, donors prefer flashier crises. Rabies deaths occur mostly in rural places, in poorer households, in children who may never appear in international headlines. The tragedy is distributed thinly enough that it doesn't always spark political fire, which is precisely why it continues. If you want a colder way to say it, rabies survives partly because it is good at hiding inside the world's indifference. Still, prevention has improved. Vaccine technology has improved. Dose-sparing strategies have improved. Surveillance has improved in places where political will exists. And when systems align, when dog vaccination campaigns are sustained and human PEP is accessible, Rabies retreats in a way that feels almost unnatural, given its ancient history. But none of this answers the question people ask when they are already too late. What happens when symptoms begin? What happens when hydrophobia arrives, when the throat becomes a trap, when the mind starts to fracture in front of witnesses? For most of medical history, the answer was, you die. The 20th century did not change that answer much. The 21st century tried to. In Part 5, we step into the rare, controversial, headline-grabbing attempts to treat symptomatic rabies. The cases that shook the fatalism, the protocols that promised too much, the survivors that became symbols, and the uncomfortable conclusion that prevention is still the only reliable mercy. Symptomatic rabies has always carried a kind of clinical finality that makes physicians speak more quietly. Not because the disease is subtle, it isn't, but because once it declares itself, modern medicine's usual bargaining chips stop working. Antibiotics don't apply. Surgery can't cut out what is already climbing inside the nervous system. Antivirals, in most cases, arrive like rain on a house fire, too little, too late, and unable to reach the rooms that matter. That's why, for a long time, the treatment of rabies after symptom onset was really an arrangement of endings. Sedation to blunt terror, dark rooms to reduce stimulation, restraints sometimes because frightened bodies can become dangerous bodies, families standing in doorways with the same helpless stare that has stared through centuries. Rabies didn't just kill, it made a spectacle of the killing. And then, in 2004, the spectacle shifted. A teenager in Wisconsin, Gina Giza, came to the hospital after a bat exposure and fell into the classic clinical deterioration that physicians learn to dread. She had not received post-exposure prophylaxis. She was not vaccinated. By the old arithmetic, she was almost certainly doomed. What happened next was not a miracle in the religious sense. It was a gamble in the medical sense. High risk, ethically heavy, scientifically uncertain, and fueled by the fact that doing nothing meant death. A team led by Dr. Rodney Willoughby induced a medically controlled coma and supported her body aggressively ventilation, careful sedation, antiviral agents, neuroprotective measures, while they hoped, in essence, that her immune system could learn fast enough to fight the virus before the virus destroyed the coordination required for life. The approach was later labeled the Milwaukee Protocol, as if naming a thing makes it more stable. Against expectation, Gina survived. The world responded the way it always does to an exception. It treated it as a new rule. Hospitals and researchers across the globe took notice. Families clung to headlines. Clinicians, some with cautious curiosity, some with desperate hope, tried to replicate the approach when they encountered symptomatic rabies. A disease once considered uniformly fatal was now, at least in one case, survivable. That fact alone was enough to change behavior. But medicine is not built on anecdotes. It is built on repetition. And repetition was where the story became complicated and bruising. Over the years that followed, attempts to reproduce Milwaukee-style treatment produced mostly heartbreak. A small number of additional survivors were reported worldwide, but the overall success rate remained very low. Reviews of the accumulating cases suggested uncomfortable patterns. Some survivors were infected with bat-associated variants rather than classic dog-mediated strains. Some showed evidence of a meaningful immune response earlier than typical. Some received partial vaccination or had unusual immunologic circumstances. In other words, the induced coma was not clearly the decisive factor in survival. The protocol had become famous faster than it had become proven. This created a profound ethical tension in critical care. When a disease is nearly always fatal, the threshold for trying experimental interventions becomes lower. desperation loosens standards. Families ask for anything. Clinicians carry the weight of knowing that anything can mean prolonged suffering, enormous cost, and still an almost certain death. An induced coma is not a gentle therapy. It is a controlled shutdown with risks, infections, blood clots, organ dysfunction, the hazards of weeks on a ventilator, the hazards of heavy sedation. In settings with abundant ICU resources, those risks can be managed. In settings where rabies is most common, rural areas in Asia and Africa, they are often not even options. So the Milwaukee Protocol became, unintentionally, a mirror for global inequality. In a high-income hospital, a symptomatic rabies patient might receive weeks of intensive support, experimental antivirals, continuous monitoring, and multidisciplinary care. In a low-resource district where vaccines are scarce, symptomatic rabies might still mean dying at home or in a clinic without sedation strong enough to quiet the spasms. The moral contrast is sharp. The world debates heroic salvage therapy in the places with few cases, while it fails to provide basic post-exposure prophylaxis in the places with tens of thousands of deaths. In the wake of the protocol's uneven performance, researchers and clinicians began pulling on a thread that turned out to be more informative than the coma itself: immunity. The rabies virus is neurotropic. It is also evasive. It travels in nerves, avoiding the bloodstream where immune surveillance is more active. It reaches the brain and alters function without necessarily causing the kind of massive cell destruction that would trigger a loud immune response early. It can, in effect, occupy the nervous system's privileged spaces. Survival, when it occurs, appears closely linked to the development of neutralizing antibodies, especially within the central nervous system. Patients who mount an antibody response, who manage to produce virus-neutralizing antibodies in sufficient quantity and in the right compartment, do better. This shifts the therapeutic imagination. Instead of kill the virus with drugs, the more realistic goal becomes help the immune system do what it rarely gets the chance to do in time. That understanding has helped reframe research priorities toward immunotherapies and passive antibody approaches, and it also explains why prevention works so well. Vaccination primes the immune system before the virus can establish its hold. If prevention is an outrun, treatment is a siege. In recent years, one of the most practical advances in rabies prevention has been the push toward replacing traditional rabies immunoglobulin, human and equine plasma-derived products, with monoclonal antibodies. Plasma-derived immunoglobulin has always been constrained. Human rabies immunoglobulin depends on donors and is expensive. Equine immunoglobulin is more affordable, but carries higher risk of adverse reactions and still requires production infrastructure. Supplies are frequently insufficient in high-burden regions. When supplies run short, the passive immunization step is skipped, and the burden falls entirely on wound care and vaccine, sometimes enough, sometimes not, depending on the exposure. Monoclonal antibodies promise consistency and scale. Instead of harvesting mixed antibodies from plasma, you engineer antibodies that bind specific sites on the rabies glycoprotein. You can manufacture them in controlled systems with predictable potency. But rabies is not one uniform target. It has lineages and antigenic diversity. A single monoclonal antibody can be outmaneuvered if the circulating variant differs at the binding site. That's why the more responsible development. If you want the least romantic truth in global health, here it is. Mass dog vaccination is the closest thing rabies has to a cure. Not for the infected individual, but for the population. It is the intervention that turns a deadly, ancient pattern into a preventable rarity. And when dog vaccination campaigns succeed, something else happens that's easy to overlook. The the social temperature changes. Communities stop expecting rabies deaths as a normal hazard of life. Parents stop treating dog bites as just part of childhood. Clinics stop rationing vaccines because demand falls. The disease moves from common fear to rare event, and rare events are easier to manage. The remaining frontier, then, is not only medical, it is ecological. Because even if dog-mediated rabies were eliminated everywhere, an achievable goal with sustained effort, rabies-like viruses persist in wildlife reservoirs. Bats, in particular, complicate every clean narrative. Their bites can be small enough to miss. Their roosting behaviors create dense networks of contact. Their mobility defies borders. And the Lysovirus genus contains multiple members beyond classic rabies virus, some with uncertain cross-protection from existing vaccines. This means the end game for rabies is not a single victory parade. It is a long maintenance phase. Surveillance, wildlife management where applicable, continued vaccination of domestic animals, and public education that remains effective even when the disease becomes rare enough to be forgotten. Forgetfulness is not benign. It is how rabies returns. In Part 6, we step into the ecology and geopolitics. Dogs as the main bridge to human death. Wildlife as the long-term reservoir. The politics of borders and reintroduction. Oral vaccination campaigns from the air, and why 0 by 30 is less about scientific discovery than about sustained governance. A virus does not care what a border is. It does not recognize the edge of a nation the way a map does. It recognizes only what ecology offers: bodies, contact, movement, and enough opportunity to keep going. This is the part of the rabies story that always drags us away from the comfort of medical language and into the colder terrain of systems and geography. Because you can treat a bite victim in a perfect clinic and still lose the larger war if the reservoir remains untouched. You can vaccinate a city's dogs and still see rabies return if the surrounding districts remain unvaccinated. You can declare victory, publish a report, hold a press conference, and then watch the disease re-enter quietly on 4 legs. For most of the world's human rabies deaths, the main bridge is still the same animal that has lived beside us for thousands of years: the domestic dog. Not wolves at the edge of forests, not vampire bats in remote caves. Dogs. The animals woven into our streets, our households, our trash, our tenderness. That fact is both horrifying and hopeful. Horrifying because it means the disease is literally inside human society, moving through the most ordinary interactions. Hopeful because dogs are, unlike many wildlife reservoirs, reachable. They can be vaccinated, they can be registered, they can be managed under law. They can be protected, and in protecting them, we protect ourselves. Yet reachable is not the same as reached. In many high-burden settings, dogs are not neatly owned. They are community-fed, semi-roaming, tolerated because they provide informal security, scavenging, companionship, or simply because removing them would be socially disruptive. In these contexts, rabies control cannot rely solely on the Western assumption that owners will bring dogs to a clinic on a posted vaccination day. There may be no clear owner. There may be distrust of authorities. There may be fear of dog catchers because history taught communities that rabies control can mean mass killing. So modern dog vaccination campaigns that succeed are not just veterinary operations. They are political negotiations carried out with syringes. They require community meetings and local champions. They require vaccinators who know how to catch dogs without injury, how to move through neighborhoods without triggering resistance, how to record coverage and return when the first pass misses animals. They require cold chain, transport, fuel, and a reliable supply of doses. They require budgets that survive elections. And most of all, they require repetition. Because dog populations turn over quickly. Puppies are born, dogs migrate. New animals arrive from adjacent areas. If you vaccinate once and stop, you don't solve rabies, you pause it. The epidemiologic target often cited, vaccinate around 70% of the dog population to interrupt transmission, is not magic. It's a practical threshold that reflects how infection moves through social networks. But achieving and sustaining that coverage is difficult in exactly the places where it matters most. This is why rabies elimination is less like a heroic campaign and more like keeping a dam repaired during a flood season that lasts for years. Then there is wildlife, the long shadow behind any plan that pretends dogs are the only story. In North America, rabies persists primarily as a wildlife disease, with distinct variants cycling through raccoons, skunks, foxes, and bats. In Europe, fox rabies once drove major public health concern in many regions, and the long, methodical use of oral vaccination baits shifted the landscape dramatically. In parts of the Arctic, fox lineages persist across distances that make control feel like an optimistic word. In Latin America, bats, especially vampire bats, maintain transmission cycles that spill into livestock and occasionally into humans, creating a different kind of economic pressure. Agriculture ministries and ranchers become part of the public health equation. Each reservoir changes the toolkit. You cannot vaccinate wild foxes with needles at scale. You vaccinate them with food. Oral rabies vaccination, ORV, was one of those public health interventions that sounds like a strange idea until you see what it accomplishes. Vaccine is packaged into bait attractive to target species, distributed across landscapes, by hand in some regions, by aircraft in others, so that animals immunize themselves. It is surveillance-driven and border-conscious. It is expensive. It requires coordination across jurisdictions because wildlife do not stop at checkpoints. Yet where ORV campaigns have been sustained, they have done something remarkable. They have shrunk the geography of rabies. Europe's success in reducing fox-mediated rabies was not a single event. It was a long logistical rhythm. Aerial distribution routes plotted like military operations, buffer zones maintained, monitoring to confirm uptake and immunity, cooperation between countries that understood a simple truth: a neighbor's failure becomes your reinfection. In North America, similar ORV strategies have been used to manage the spread of raccoon rabies and to protect previously unaffected regions. The work is never perfect. Landscapes are complicated. Animal behavior is unpredictable. Weather disrupts distribution. But the principle holds. If you can immunize the reservoir, you can lower spillover. Bats, however, remain the most unsettling complication. Not because they are evil, but because their ecology resists simple governance. They travel. They roost in buildings. Their bites can be small enough that a person, especially a sleeping child, may not realize exposure occurred. And bats are associated not only with classic rabies virus, but with a broader set of lyssaviruses, some of which differ antigenically in ways that complicate assumptions about vaccine coverage. This does not mean standard rabies vaccines are useless against bat exposures. Far from it. It means the long-term picture is more complex than vaccinate dogs and we're done. It means surveillance matters. It means research must remain active even after dog-mediated rabies deaths are eliminated, because the genus is larger than the single most famous species. And complexity again brings us back to governance. Rabies control succeeds where systems are integrated. Human health, animal health, and environmental surveillance working together. This is what people mean by One Health, a phrase that can sound like a conference slogan until you see how rabies punishes the lack of it. If clinics treat bite victims but veterinary services cannot vaccinate dogs, exposures continue. If veterinary services vaccinate dogs but clinics cannot provide PEP, deaths continue. If surveillance is weak, outbreaks smolder undetected. If borders are porous without cooperation, reinvasion undoes years of progress. So the best rabies programs behave like living networks. Data moves quickly. Communication between veterinary and public health departments is routine. Communities understand what to do after bites. Schools teach children not to handle bats and not to approach unfamiliar animals. Dog vaccination is not an annual miracle. It is a scheduled civic service. This is the logic behind the global 0 by 30 target. End dog-mediated human rabies deaths by 2030. The ambition is not unrealistic in scientific terms. We already have the tools. The obstacle is whether the world will pay for the unglamorous work required to use them consistently. Because rabies elimination in practice is not primarily an invention problem, it is an implementation problem. It is procurement. It is cold boxes. It is trained staff. It is fuel for vehicles. It is data collection that doesn't get falsified to satisfy supervisors. It is the ability to show up again next year, and when those things are present, rabies retreats so thoroughly that people begin to forget why they ever feared it. That forgetfulness is dangerous. When a disease becomes rare, budgets shift. Attention drifts. The small number of cases that still occur become exceptions. And exceptions are where rabies likes to live, because exceptions are where systems are allowed to fail without scandal. So the end game is maintenance, and maintenance is a form of discipline. In the old world, cities disciplined dogs with muzzles and fire. In the modern world, we discipline rabies with vaccination, surveillance, and steady administration. The instruments are kinder, but the requirement is the same. A community must decide repeatedly that this particular terror will not be allowed to return. And that decision has to be made by people with budgets, not just by people with good intentions. In Part 7, we close the arc, the long chain from ancient law and ritual to modern laboratories and dog vaccination campaigns. The ethical problem of spending on prevention versus heroic ICU care, and the quiet truth that rabies, for all its horror, is one of the clearest tests of whether a society can deliver basic protection to its most vulnerable. There are diseases that frighten us because they arrive like storms, sudden, loud, and public. And then there are diseases that frighten us because they arrive like secrets. Rabies has always been the second kind. It gives you time to forget the bite, time to convince yourself the wound was nothing, time to return to ordinary life until ordinary life begins to thin and the body starts behaving like a place you no longer own. That is why rabies sits so deep in human memory. It doesn't just kill, it betrays the timeline. And for most of history, communities responded to that betrayal with whatever they had. Law, ritual, violence, story. The ancient world translated the fear into liability. Because when you don't understand a mechanism, you manage the consequences. A dog bites, a life changes, and the city must decide what to do with the owner, with the animal, with the risk that now hangs over the neighborhood like smoke. Temples and shrines filled the explanation gap with gods and incantations, because human beings cannot live easily beside a threat that has no name. They need a frame. They need the feeling that someone, divine or civic, can be appealed to. The classical world began to record symptoms with more discipline, turning possession-like spectacle into clinical description. The medieval world braided observation with theology and folklore, because when a disease looks like madness, it invites moral readings. Werewolves and vampires weren't just entertainment, they were cultural tools. ways of describing violent transformation when biology wasn't yet a usable language. Then cities grew denser and governance grew sharper. Muzzles, pounds, ordinances, dog catchers, public health in its early, sometimes brutal form. Not because officials were enlightened, but because markets, children, and social order demanded it. A rabid dog in a crowded street is not only a medical tragedy, it is a civic humiliation. It says the city cannot control what moves through it. And then the laboratory asserted itself not as a moral authority, but as a technical one. Rabies became transmissible in experiments, and that experimental reproducibility cracked the spell of randomness. It meant the disease could be studied, interrupted, outrun. Pasteur's post-exposure vaccination, more a disciplined gamble than a neat invention, shifted the meaning of a bite. A bite was no longer only a sentence, it was a race, and medicine might be able to help you win if you arrived in time. Pathology and diagnostics then tightened the net. Negri bodies gave a signature, fluorescent testing gave speed, molecular methods gave lineage in surveillance. The invisible became trackable, and trackable threats can be managed, not perfectly, not everywhere, but with enough consistency to change history. Which brings us to the modern truth that feels almost insulting in its simplicity. Most human rabies deaths are preventable. Not preventable in the rhetorical way, not preventable if everything goes right and miracles happen. Preventable in the practical way. Soap and water on a wound, vaccines on a schedule, immunoglobulin when warranted, and above all, the quiet public health miracle that doesn't trend online. Vaccinating dogs until transmission breaks. The hardest part of rabies control is not the biology, it is the steadiness. The hardest part is building systems that do not depend on panic to function. Because panic is expensive and late. Panic spends money after exposure. Panic spends money in the ICU when the odds are terrible. Panic spends money on dog culls that satisfy anger but do not reliably break transmission. Panic is loud and short-lived. Prevention is boring and persistent. And that creates an ethical dilemma that every society answers, whether it admits it or not. Will we invest in the unglamorous work that saves the most lives, or will we reserve our resources for dramatic last-ditch rescues that make better stories? The Milwaukee Protocol and the rare survivals it inspired forced this question into public view. It showed that survival after symptom onset might be possible under certain circumstances, but it also showed how rare and resource-heavy that survival is, and how difficult it is to separate true effect from extraordinary luck variant differences, immune responses, timing, the unrepeatable chemistry of a specific patient. Those rare survivals matter. They push research forward. They teach immunology. They keep clinicians from surrendering entirely. They are not meaningless. But if we're honest in the way rabies demands, the moral center of the story is still prevention. A world that cannot reliably provide post-exposure prophylaxis to bitten children has no business treating experimental ICU protocols as its main hope. A world that cannot fund mass dog vaccination cannot claim it has done what it knows how to do. Rabies is a litmus test for governance. It asks a simple question in a harsh voice. Can you deliver basic protection to people who do not have power? Because the typical rabies victim is not a headline-friendly patient. The typical victim is a child. The typical exposure happens in a place where dogs roam and clinics are far. The typical death happens after delays, delay in recognizing the risk, delay in reaching care, delay in finding vaccine, delay in completing a regimen. Rabies doesn't need malice, it only needs gaps. And gaps are political. A broken cold chain is political. A clinic without immunoglobulin is political. A dog vaccination program that runs once and then loses funding is political. A border without cooperation is political. A surveillance system that doesn't count rural deaths is political. In the modern era, rabies persists less as an ancient mystery than as a mirror held up to the machinery of public health. Where the machinery is strong, rabies becomes rare. Where the machinery is weak, rabies remains an old terror with new paperwork. So if you want to know what the future of rabies looks like, don't look for a single breakthrough. Look for budgets. Look for training. Look for vaccine procurement and distribution. Look for whether ministries can coordinate human and animal health without turning it into a turf war. Look for whether communities trust vaccinators enough to bring dogs forward rather than hide them. Look for whether we can sustain the work after the fear fades, because that is the last trick rabies plays. It becomes rare enough that people stop believing it is real, and the moment people stop believing, the virus finds its opening again, not through magic, but through neglect. At the Forbidden Dispensary, we keep these histories not to decorate the darkness, but to map it. Rabies is one of the clearest maps we have, a long line from clay tablets and whispered curses to fluorescent microscopes and vaccination campaigns. A story where the monster was never supernatural, even when it wore supernatural masks. A story where the most powerful weapon is not bravery, not myth, not spectacle, but a set of procedures done on time, every time, for people who may never be thanked. If you're listening tonight and you take one practical thing away, let it be this. Bites are emergencies. Wash the wound aggressively. Seek medical care immediately. Don't negotiate with the calendar. Don't wait for certainty if the risk is credible. Rabies is a disease where the cost of being wrong is too high, and the cost of acting early is, by comparison, small. And if you take one societal thing away, let it be this. A world that can send probes to distant planets can also vaccinate dogs and stock clinics. The barrier is not intelligence, it is choice. The fear is ancient. The tools are modern. The outcome now is optional. That's where we leave it for tonight, on the edge between dread and duty, where so much of public health lives. Good evening from the Forbidden Dispensary. Keep your doors latched, keep your light low, and remember, the oldest monsters are often just biology wearing a story.